go for gold, because that's what the climate demands of us. We have to go for gold. There is no negotiating with nature. And I'm excited by the current disruption, because I think ultimately we might be able to get something. We certainly can't just by going along as business as usual.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Welcome to Follow the Money. I'm Glenn Connley. On this podcast several weeks ago, we talked about Australia's failing flagship climate policy, the Safeguard Mechanism. As the federal government begins a wide-ranging review of the scheme, the dodgy carbon credits and offsets at the heart of the system are coming under fire. The Albanese government recently abandoned Climate Active, its farcical carbon-neutral certification scheme. In New South Wales, the state government has just banned coal and gas companies from buying carbon credits generated by the planned Great Koala National Park. It's an important admission that Australia cannot cancel out the pollution from fossil fuel projects by simply promising not to chop down some trees. So, could Australia's climate policy finally be heading in the right direction? With me today to try and unpack it all is Australia Institute co-CEO Leanne Minshull and Research Director Rod Campbell. Now, there's a lot of moving parts in the world of climate, conservation and politics at the moment, and a lot of it seems to be centred on New South Wales. Rod, where should we start? What do our listeners need to know?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Well, I think what we really should start on is what the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, said last week. And he said that he's not going to sell any of his lovely carbon credits to nasty coal and gas mines. In particular, he was saying any carbon credits that he might be able to generate through making a koala national park, he absolutely will not sell that to coal and gas mines. So they've been wanting to make this koala national park for quite a long time. There's been a lot of controversy over there's a lot of controversy over carbon credits, carbon offsets in general, but particularly the idea that we were going to only make a koala national park if we can flog off the carbon offsets. This has been an issue for a little while, but what really happened last week that's new and interesting is the New South Wales Premier saying he's not going to sell koala park offsets to coal and gas mines. Let's start there.
Glenn, can I take it back a little bit? Because I agree with Rod. That is what's new and interesting. What's old and depressing but worthy to remind people is that you actually can't offset emissions that you pump into the air by pretending that carbon will be captured in a tree. The science people tell us that there is no fungibility between those two concepts. So you're taking prehistoric, buried deep underground fossil fuels, you're burning them and putting them in the air, and then you're pretending that the carbon that is part already of a cycle in trees will be enough to sequester that carbon that you've pumped out into the atmosphere. So that just doesn't work. And I think that that's fundamental for people to understand, even before we get to the point, where the Premier's kind of got a koala with a gun to its head saying, give me carbon credits or the koala gets it. The science tells us that this isn't possible to do. So if we want to reduce emissions, we have to stop pumping out carbon into the atmosphere and protect our natural ecosystems. And one of the biggest ecosystems that we have in Australia, and one of the easiest ways to help us stabilise the climate, is to stop native forest logging.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little more. Leanne, why is it important to split the koala park from the coal mines?
Well, Glenn, because we're in the point of the climate crisis where science is telling us we can't actually offset one bad thing with one good thing. And even if we could, so sometimes there's hard to abate industries that we want to help them on their journey. And if we want to do that, then we can say, we know you're going to try and reduce your emissions. We're going to help you by allowing some of your bad stuff after you've tried to reduce your emissions to be offset by something else. Now, that works in economics, maybe. Unfortunately for us, you can't negotiate with nature, and that doesn't work scientifically. The emissions from burning fossil fuels that are currently buried deep underground is not the same as the carbon that you can draw down into forests and trees. So there's no fungibility. It's a word I never thought I'd know, but now I do.
The way I like to explain it is like fossil carbon, like the actual carbon atoms might be the same, but from a climate perspective, fossil carbon is different to tree carbon. And that's because there's a hint in the name. Fossil carbon stays under the ground for millions of years, while trees live for tens of years or maybe 100 years. And so from the climate's perspective, you want as much carbon as possible under the ground and relatively less carbon. It's still good to have it in trees. We still want to conserve trees, but trees just aren't as good at keeping carbon out of the atmosphere as having it in a fossil under the ground.
Yeah. And also the trees are in their own ecosystem, and they're in an ecosystem that we have to protect and we have to secure biodiversity. And without doing that, so let's just leave the trees alone by themselves. Let's not pretend that trees are part of a made-up system, which is the economy. Sorry, Rod, I know you're an economist, but we can't, that's all very well that humans do this. But the fact is, like Rod said, it's different. We can't offset the carbon that we're pushing up into the air in our trees. And it's just silly to pretend that we can.
Back in 2015, the Australian Labor Party in New South Wales promised the people of New South Wales what they called the Great Koala Park.
A big reason for the delay in the gazetting of the park is the government wants to monetise the trees for carbon credits, and it doesn't want to gazette the park until it's got a carbon credit method in place and approved.
You have to have the system up and running before you can quarantine a park or an area to allow for that area or that zone to be eligible for the carbon transfer. If you do it in reverse, then you can't retroactively go to that national park or that forest and say, this will now apply to carbon offsets in the future.
Can I ask about the politics and the timing? Because whether it's right or wrong, a tiny bit right and a big bit wrong, Chris Minns, from memory, announced there was going to be a Great Koala National Park when he was opposition leader, long before there was any discussion about climate credits and ACCUs and what have you.
Leanne?
Yes, That's right, he did. So this Koala National Park's been promised for about 11 years, give or take. It was a key plank in the promises that was made by the then Minns opposition government in New South Wales. And so from a political perspective, I think the goalposts have really shifted. And if people in New South Wales and the environment movement don't, hold the government to their promises, then I think we're setting up a bad precedent in all sorts of ways. But to think that the government can't afford to do this without some sort of economic benefit is just, it's just crazy.
Did you want to add to that, Rod?
Yeah, I mean, I want to move back onto what the Premier said last week. And so we've been trundling along with this pretty fraught argument that Leanne's outlined of how we might be swapping koala habitat for carbon credits that could be sold to coal and gas mines. And suddenly the New South Wales Premier has come out and said, actually, we're not going to do that. We shouldn't sell our lovely koala credits to nasty coal and gas mines. And this is actually big news. This is the first time an Australian government, the Premier of the largest state, has come out and said, actually, there are projects that shouldn't have some of these offsets sold to them. And this is actually a big step forward. So
is he Robinson Crusoe on this? Is this Minns' principle of not using dodgy offsets to justify coal mines a new thing?
Yeah, I like it, Glenn. Let's call it the Minns principle. The Minns principle that you shouldn't use land-based offsets to justify fossil fuel projects. Chris Minns is absolutely right, and he is absolutely not Robinson Crusoe on this. And we've had even some of the biggest supporters of the Koala Park offsets schmozzle are actually on board with this idea that these offsets shouldn't be sold to coal and gas projects. So, the big environment groups are on board with this, like Greenpeace and WWF. They're in the media today saying, no, don't sell koala credits to fossil fuel companies. And perhaps more interestingly is how this lines up with what one of Australia's biggest fossil fuel companies, Energy Australia, said last year. They said, and I quote, "Some carbon offsets claim to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by planting trees or forest regeneration. However, Energy Australia today accepts the scientific consensus that these offsets," and the scare quotes are theirs, not mine, "do not indefinitely remove greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels, because carbon is stored in plants for a substantially shorter time than those emissions remain in the atmosphere. Storing carbon in plants is not equivalent to keeping it stored in fossil fuels by not burning the fossil fuels in the first place." So those are the words of one of Australia's biggest fossil fuel companies saying, don't use trees to justify fossil fuel use. And that's exactly the same thing as what the New South Wales Premier is now saying. So, are we starting to see a little bit, I think it's far from us to declare end to the climate wars and that kind of thing, but we are starting to see some pretty important agreement around carbon credits and the need to not use them for fossil fuel expansion.
Rod, what was the context of that? Why did Energy Australia say that? Presumably it was very different to the conversation we're having now about the Great Koala National Park.
Yeah, you're right. One of Australia's biggest coal-burning companies didn't just wake up in the morning and decide we're going to say something sensible on climate. They were pushed into it by community activism, specifically by a group called Parents for Climate Action, who took exception to Energy Australia and their greenwashing, and they're claiming to be carbon neutral around some of their electricity generation when they clearly weren't. It was Energy Australia using dodgy offsets to claim that their fossil fuel use was somehow clean or awesome. They lost in court and were forced to make this scientifically based statement. And similarly, the New South Wales Premier didn't just decide, oh, great, I'm going to jump on board with the climate science. He was forced to do this because lots of community activists were jumping up and down saying, you're trying to trade koalas for coal. This is a bad idea. And the political cartoons started to come out of koalas marching down the street with signs saying no coal mines. So it is great that some of these powerful people are on side. None of them did it because they woke up and thought they want to do something good for the climate. They did it because they were forced to by climate activists. But we're still getting there. I still think it's worth a bit of celebration. Long live the Minns principle.
And Rod, was that quote that you read out from Energy Australia, that was all part of I know it was the court case taken by Parents for Climate Action, but was the scheme the Climate Active scheme that they were talking about that was just shut down recently?
Yeah, I'm not. That's another really important point. I'm not exactly sure the relationship between Climate Active and the Energy Australia Parents for Climate Action case, but you're spot on, Leanne, that there is a pattern emerging here. So a year ago, Energy Australia, big fossil fuel company, had to say land-based offsets, forest offsets don't offset fossil fuel emissions. Then last month, we saw the federal government's big climate active, I would call it a greenwashing program. They called it a climate accreditation program. It was folded. The government abandoned it after years of pressure from people like our colleague Polly Hemming, because it simply doesn't work. It is using these dodgy offsets to justify fossil fuel use, and too many big corporate users of that government program bailed on it. In particular, Telstra was a big one that a lot of people campaigned on. Yeah, again, this was because of campaigns. It was because of community pressure. Corporate users left Climate Active, and eventually the government had to fold it. So a year ago, Energy Australia outlining what we're now calling the MINS principle. Essentially, the MINS principle at play a month ago in the folding of Climate Active, and now last week, Premier Minns coming out and saying it really articulately that he's not going to sell forest offsets to coal and gas companies. It is a bit of a pattern. It feels like there's a bit of momentum, and it only happened because of people's really hard work.
It feels like the dominoes are crashing down. If I was a potential offset sitting there waiting to be sold from a forest, I'd be thinking, well, first of all, Victoria and Western Australia said, no, we don't want to go for this. We're just going to end our native forest logging. Then we've got all the things that you've outlined, Rod, and we've got the MINS principle.
Can we make some merchandise as you as a carbon offset?
Sure, I'd love that.
We are denying reality if we think we're taking climate action, if we're not shutting off the tap of the poison that is driving climate change as fast as it's humanly possible.
Why do we need new coal and gas?
Well, what we need is a sensible... Saying no new coal and gas is frankly a slogan, not a policy.
Perhaps I could throw this to you both. How significant a step, how important a moment is this in the end game of actually burning less fossil fuels?
Look, I think this is really interesting because on the one hand, Chris Minns coming out and saying, I'm not going to sell these credits to coal mines means absolutely nothing, because the coal mines will just buy the credits from somebody else, and other people will buy the smelters or manufacturers or data centers, or somebody will buy the koala offsets. So it doesn't actually really put up any significant problems for coal and gas mines. What it does put up significant problems for is Australia's overall climate policy. So we're about to have a big review of our federal safeguard mechanism. The safeguard mechanism is entirely based on offsets and fossil fuel companies using offsets to justify their expansion. That is 90% of what the safeguard mechanism is, and it's just been fundamentally undermined by the New South Wales Premier. So, on the one hand, means nothing. On the other hand, it's a massive change for it really is a crack in the wall of Australian climate inaction.
Well, I'm just going to quote Dennis Denuno, and it's the vibe from the castle, because it really is. This stuff is run on smoke and mirrors, and it's all too confusing, and we can't really think about it. But when you match the vibe that Rod's just gone through with the fact that despite the safeguard mechanism wanting to help Australia reduce its emissions have gone up. They haven't gone down. So we know it's not working. Now we don't even have the vibe. I'm just wondering what the last plank will be in trying to unpick this Gordian knot. And I think that's what's going to unfold over the next 6 months or so, because the government does have to review the safeguard mechanism. The current MINS plan and the Great Koala National Park could go one way or the other, because there's a disallowance motion on the table at the moment. And for listeners who don't follow the ins and outs of the way that laws are made, if you want to put something up for legislation, the House tables the legislation, the Senate debates it, changes it or passes it, it goes back to the House. This new model for setting up the offsets to be sold from the koala habitat is just a regulation. So the only way to stop a regulation, because it doesn't go to the Senate, is for the Senate to put in something called a disallowance motion. So the Nats have put forward a disallowance motion. They don't think that this method's good. They don't want the offsets being sold from the koala habitat. They've got their own reasons for that. And then it'll go for a vote on August 18th, and depending on which way the Greens vote and the Liberals, but presuming the Liberals and the Nats vote together, then this method could be disallowed. Now, that won't stop the method. It will stop the method for the moment, but it won't stop the momentum to sell koala habitat for offsets. But I think when we go back and look at what Rod has outlined and the dominoes falling down and the Dennis Denudo effect, it'll just be one more, kerplonk stick taken out in the charade that is offsets.
For anyone under the age of about 35, 40, I'm just going to... The community service announcement that Dennis Denudo was a character in the 90s comedy called The Castle. It was a movie that they played in these buildings called cinemas. It was pretty well known amongst
Rod,
people our age.
The Castle's iconic.
Before we even get into the integrity of what Mins is suggesting and the fact that fossil fuel companies may eventually be able to buy these credits, the Mins decision is not, though, like a court case, is it? There's no precedent here. Everybody won't simply have to follow what he's done because he's done it on this occasion, will they?
No, absolutely not. You've hit a key point there, Glenn, that here is a state premier wanting to basically pull a shifty deal on getting paid to do something that he should be doing anyway. And what's to stop other premiers doing exactly the same thing? So you're right. The Tasmanian and the Queensland premiers will be looking on with great interest, and the only way to keep the Mins principle sacred of not selling land-based offsets to justify fossil fuels is to stick it in legislation somewhere, and I think ideally in federal legislation.
And we haven't seen the detail here either in terms of the on-selling or trading either, have we?
No. There's another key point. There's a hell of a lot of detail that we haven't seen, and including we haven't seen the submissions in relation to all of this. So, it's a long story on how these offset methods are made, but what is meant to happen is that submissions on them are meant to be published, and that's never happened. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of legal questions around all of this.
And also, how will it be implemented? How do you stop a secondary market for the offsets? What is the legislation that Mins will have to put forward to enshrine his Mins principle? How will he make that binding to future governments? Like, it does really open up, it poses more questions than what it answers, that's for sure. The other thing too, actually, Rod, sorry,
there's
Glenn.
There's a lot of other things.
There's a lot of other things, but one of the other things, if you're going to sell carbon offsets, the majority of them are bought by gas and coal. They're bought by fossil fuels, right? So I think it's around 61%. So it does beg the question, if you do take them out of the market, who are we selling to? Is it aluminium smelters? Is it electricity generators like Energy Australia, who had to admit that it wasn't that you can't offset in land-based activity what you push into the atmosphere, which would be kind of ironic.
Or is it data centres?
Is it data centres? Don't know.
But either way here, right, Chris Mins is doing something he was always going to do and paying for it by somehow letting somebody trash the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. He was always going to do it. He promised to do it. They all promised to do it for about 10 years. And the idea that you should be paid for doing something you've promised to do for the last 10 years is absolutely outrageous. So, no, this is a huge demonstration of what a sham a lot of Australia's carbon market is. It's fundamental to carbon credits that what you're doing is meant to result in additional carbon coming out of the atmosphere. And so if what you're doing is what you always said you were going to do, there's nothing additional. And this word additionality, it's in all the rules and regulation and legislation around offsets. Things have to be additional. And in fact, in a working paper we're going to put out in the coming days, a friend of the Institute, Fergus Green, outlines the extraordinary, he calls it legal gymnastics, that this proposal has gone through to rewrite rules around additionality and give itself an exemption from them. So, no, it's a complete sham.
And we are already suggesting in a submission to the review of the safeguard mechanism that In fact, the entire system of offsets and credits should potentially be scrapped, right?
Yeah. So the Australia Institute has had a long history of trying to make carbon credits as good as they possibly can. So where somebody is paid money to do something that's good for the climate, whether that's planting trees, protecting trees, getting carbon into soils, we should do that. And the idea that governments could set up a fund like the Abbott government did and use that fund to pay people to do things that are good for the climate, good for biodiversity, and give them credits for it out of a fund, that is okay. What the real problem is when you start using those carbon credits, those good things that people are doing, to justify trashing the planet somewhere else. So let's justify gas expansion because of some lovely trees that somebody planted somewhere else. That is the problem.
It's called a safeguard mechanism, and it's meant to be a piece of climate regulation that limits the greenhouse gas emissions of Australia's biggest polluters, half of which are coal and gas companies. So, turns out that if a company exceeds that limit, all they have to do is buy a bunch of cheap carbon offsets, and they can claim to be in compliance.
If the Albanese government is going to sort of stand up to its progressive credentials and our legislated climate targets, then something really needs to be done about our flagship policy.
Can I ask you, Leanne, about the Senate vote in a couple of weeks? You've mentioned that if the disallowance motion succeeds, it stops. So what would happen next?
Well, a number of things could happen. I think if you look at it in terms of when Parliament's sitting and also the election cycle for New South Wales. So New South Wales has got a state election coming up, I think, in March next year. So it's not too far off. They'll only have a limited amount of sitting days. Then you go to the regulator, who Rod was talking about before, and the fact that so in the process, all the submissions went in for this particular method, and then those submissions are supposed to be made public within a reasonable time. So I would say that it's not reasonable because they're still not out and it's already gone to Parliament and we still haven't seen what's in the submission. So that's actually quite unusual. But to your question, it would have to go through some other sort of process. It would have to be also nominated by the minister, so by Chris Bowen. And so this will continue. This conversation will continue. We will continue to have people want to sell carbon credits. But for the Koala National Park, I think if this particular method is disallowed on August 18th, then in some ways it's halfway back to a drawing board. And it enters the broader conversation around methodology in general. So not just for the Koala National Park, but in general. And it also starts to feed into the safeguard mechanism review, which I actually think is where it should be. And then in the meantime, if the New South Wales government had any credibility and they were acting like a responsible premier on behalf of the environment and people that he is supposed to be looking after, they would stop logging in the koala habitat, and they would, like just this morning, a koala apparently had its jaw broken and its back and had to be euthanized because it was knocked out by logging operations. So I think that's the way I would like to see it go. Like put a stop on this methodology because there's too many questions around it. Get the MINS principle really properly into all of the different reviews that are currently going on, including the safeguard mechanism review. I think that's a really good conversation to have. And Rod's right. It has moved the conversation. Having a premier say that offsets shouldn't go to coal and gas is fantastic. And then in the meantime, there is nothing stopping the premier from protecting the koalas that he should have protected 4 years ago when he was first elected.
But that's one of the great tragedies here, right? So while the Minns government has sat on its hands waiting to do this dodgy deal, logging has continued in this koala habitat.
Well, it's not just continued. Apparently they're ripping into it because they can see the end in sight. So they also want to make as much money or get as many subsidies, depending on what way you look at it, as possible before the inevitability of the park being proclaimed.
Okay, so Rod, we should celebrate the Minns principle carefully, but in your mind, this doesn't signal an end to the climate wars?
No, absolutely. And in parallel to everything we've just discussed, New South Wales is currently assessing its largest coal project in years. The Hunter Valley Operations coal mine is currently being assessed by the Independent Planning Commission. It'd dig up 400 million tonnes of coal over the next 25 years. And it is one of the key potential buyers of new offsets. So, while there's, the Senate disallowance vote, there's the safeguard mechanism, there's all these things happening at a federal level. At a New South Wales level, there's coal projects, there's the ever-present Santos Narrabri gas project. There's all these fossil fuel projects in the state planning process that are looking at New South Wales climate legislation. They're looking at New South Wales' ability to produce carbon offsets, and they're working out how to try and jam themselves through the planning process as quickly as possible.
So if these credits were to land in their hands, the creation of a great big national park could literally be a case of more harm than good.
Yeah, I mean, look, we should, of course, we should protect koala habitat, and we should also be stopping big new coal mines and gas projects. So, there is a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts here, and one thing we haven't talked about is how parts of the New South Wales bureaucracy are actually, like, brace yourself, starting to do their jobs properly. The New South Wales Net Zero Commission has really been pushing the need to cut carbon emissions from coal mining and to phase out coal mining. The New South Wales EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, is doing the same thing. Like, they're actually trying to protect the environment. I'm not sure if that's because there's particularly good people in charge, or if they're being helped by the New South Wales government's relatively recent climate legislation and its net zero targets. But yeah, there is a huge battle going on at the moment about fossil fuels and what to approve and what not to approve and how that's going to work. And offsets are a big part of it, and koalas are a big part of it. There's lots going on, and I feel we've only just scratched the surface. One thing I really think listeners should try and take away from this, if anyone who's interested in climate policy in Australia, is that New South Wales actually has something special. And this is part of the reason why we're talking about New South Wales or most of the conversation today. New South Wales has this legislated, passed through the parliament, climate target that New South Wales as a state has to hit its targets and become net zero by 2050 within New South Wales. So they can't buy offsets from somewhere else, and they can't buy dodgy offsets from Western Australia and say, oh, we're just going to have all the coal and gas we want here. They can't say we're going to have a new gas project. Oh, we'll buy some forestry offsets from down in Tasmania. New South Wales has actually set itself the target that Australia more broadly has set ourselves of doing it alone. And so what this means is any new gas or coal project or a big data centre or whatever it is that's in New South Wales is going to impose some kind of abatement cost, some kind of need for the rest of the New South Wales community to reduce their carbon emissions. And that's what these parts of the New South Wales bureaucracy, the EPA, the Net Zero Commission, that's what they're really pushing the planning department and the government on. So, I think it's really exciting and really interesting of, can that kind of basic climate legislation, which, I must admit, when I first saw it go through, I didn't think it was that big a deal. But seeing how it has activated the broader machinery of government to really push for good climate policy, I think is really exciting and really interesting.
So, Leanne, we have an important Senate vote coming up. We've heard something positive, albeit maybe with some integrity issues, from Chris Minns, and we have a review of the safeguard mechanism. Is there some reason for hope for decent climate policy in the next year or so?
Look, I think there is. And I think the thing that gives me hope is that it's not business as usual. And because it's not business as usual, this is exactly the wrong time for community groups, environment groups, and policy experts to grab for what they think will be something on the way out. Okay, I just think this is exactly the time to not give up, to understand that it is no longer business as usual for all of the reasons that we've just gone through, and to go for gold, because that's what the climate demands of us. We have to go for gold. There is no negotiating with nature, and I'm excited by the current disruption because I think ultimately we might be able to get something. We certainly can't just by going along as business as usual.
Go for gold. Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week. And if you want to hear more about phasing out fossil fuels, join us in Sydney for our Climate Integrity Summit. It'll bring together global political leaders, economists, advocates, artists, and musicians for a day of big ideas and bold conversations. It's on at the Parliament of New South Wales on Tuesday, the 15th of September. Get your tickets now at australiainstitute.org.au or via the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 4th of August, and some things may have changed. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Glenn Connley. Thanks for listening.